these machine learning techniques can make the decision-making process easier, democratizing access to models and data all across the enterprise, and can be really relevant to anyone from a product manager to the CFO, not just the traditional actuaries and data scientists.
You're listening to Rethinking Insurance, a podcast series from WTW where we discuss the issues facing P&C, life, and composite insurers around the globe, as well as exploring the latest tools, techniques, and innovations that will help you rethink insurance.
Hello, and welcome to Rethinking Insurance. I'm your host, Ravi Sharma. On today's podcast, we'll be discussing layered GBMs with Madeline, an Associate Director in WTW's Insurance Consulting and Technology Practice, and Rachael McNaughton, an Associate Director in WTW's Insurance Consulting and Technology Practice. Welcome to you both.
Hi, Ravi. Thanks for having me.
Hey, and thanks for having me as well.
I'm happy to have you both on the show. Now, as many of you know, we like to learn a little bit about our guests before we jump into our main topic. So what's something that you both like to do outside of work? Madeline, let's start with you.
I enjoy doing holiday crafts with my toddler.
Oh, well, that sounds super interesting, and I'm sure it's very fun. So, Rachael, what about you?
I actually really enjoy spending time with my dog, who very nerdily I have called Data, just because I love taking my work home with me.
Oh, I love it. That's a perfect name for a dog. So let's transition into today's main topic, layered GBMs. For those who don't know what a layered GBM is, Rachael, could you define that for us?
Yeah, sure, Ravi. So a layered GBM is a modification of a traditional gradient boosting machine algorithm. So the way a traditional gradient boosting machine algorithm works is it essentially builds up lots and lots of decision trees, one after the other, each of them trying to predict the difference between how the model's currently doing and what the actual values are. So it gets closer and closer and closer as you add more and more trees to the right answer. So one of the problems with the way the gradient boosting machine works is that as it builds up more and more trees, and there can be thousands within these types of models, it's not at all clear what sort of effects or trends there are in the actual model. So if you compare that to a generalized linear model or a GLM, where you'll have your main effects and your interaction effects very clearly isolated within the model definition itself. With a gradient boosting machine, you lose all of that isolation, and it's not clear at all, and you can only approximate after the fact whether there's a, if it's a main effect or it's an interaction and what's going on in the model at all. So the way a layered GBM works is it essentially breaks up the process. So instead of just building a decision tree that can capture your main effects, interaction effects all at once and get it all muddled, it essentially forces some structure. So what it will do is it will build the first layer first, which captures all main effects. Once it's captured all the main effects and there's nothing left to find with just looking at a single variable, we can then move on to the second layer, and then it will build the second layer, marginalizing out all of the one-way main effects and focusing just on building up the interaction effects with two factors in it, and so on and so forth. So it still captures exactly the same predictive accuracy that a GBM will do, so it will be just as accurate as a traditional GBM, but it's forcing the interpretation or forcing the effects to be split out over independent layers. So that you can better understand and isolate where the effects actually are in that model.
Great, removing one of the common pitfalls, the black box of a GBM, so you can kind of have your cake and eat it too. How does this address the pitfalls of machine learning?
This is an interesting one. So, we've spent a lot of time with my team looking at applying machine learning to insurance. I've always found it really, really interesting, much more so than generic applications of machine learning, because in insurance, we have a lot more to worry about. It's not just about the predictive accuracy. We have to think about regulations. We have to think about actually being able to understand and interpret our models, and much more so than you typically have to do elsewhere. And so we found when trying to apply machine learning methods that have been developed for other industries, there were a lot of challenges in doing that. So often we found that actually, whilst we wanted to use the automation, very high predictive power that machine learning models would provide. Often that came at quite a big cost when it comes to being able to interpret those models. And, as an industry where we've had a very long history of being able to use GLMs very, very effectively, a lot of the times, whilst we can gain automation from using something like a gradient boosting machine, say, it comes at too much of a cost. So where we have the ability to know exactly what effects and variables are impacting our prices with a GLM implementation, when we try and use something like a GBM, for example, or other machine learning methods, we just lose all of that interpretability, and it is quite a big hurdle to cross. Instead of just using the open source machine learning approaches, we have some very, very smart people on the team. We thought, why not create an algorithm designed to have all of that automation, same level of predictiveness, but with the interpretability built in by design so that we didn't have to give that up as well.
That's great. Yeah, and I know this is something Madeline's super passionate about, because I know I've heard her on several calls before talk about democratizing the access to the models. And so, Madeline, I think that's a good segue into getting access to users who don't traditionally have access to this type of analysis. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, so I think that traditionally GBMs, not to call out Rachael as a data scientist, but I feel like they've been kind of relegated to the realm of data scientists and some of those very highly analytical types. And oftentimes business users aren't as able to see in a very intuitive fashion how the GBM could apply to their actual business decisions. And so one of the things I think is really cool is that Rachael's team has developed a layered GBM that really allows you to see in an intuitive way how the different variables are impacting the model. And then through our decision support platform, Radar, you're able to give access to those GBMs to product management and senior leaders, so that even like if, let's say, your CFO asks this current inflationary environment, how is that going to impact my rate changes over the next year? How are my results going to change? And really being able to bring all the insights of machine learning in an intuitive fashion to folks who might not have had access to that in the past.
So in Rachael's description of GBMs and machine learning specifically, she talked a little bit about regulation. And I know in the US, we're in a totally different regulatory environment than other places in the world. So Rachael, I was hoping you could elaborate on how this is relevant in the UK.
Yeah, it's actually quite interesting. It's especially from the regulatory point of view, it's probably a little bit less relevant than it is in the US. We certainly have, regulations in place, and it's probably almost more of a cultural and business-led thing that really drove it in the UK. A lot of insurers are already using a lot of machine learning techniques in the UK. GBMs are very, very popular. So it's actually more just seeing the challenges that people faced when implementing those. So we actually got to see, insurers get to the point where they were implementing their GBMs, but the true cost at which they did that, the fact that, when they're trying to understand what it is exactly those models are doing, when they're trying to justify them to their internal model governance boards, it was very much an approximation. Any kind of analysis or interpretation of what was going on. And some clients were okay with that, but more often than not, we found that was actually a really, really big hurdle, and that they were losing a lot in not being able to fully understand with confidence what the model was actually doing. And in fact, actually, for a lot of the cases, it was more so that yes, they were trying to understand and interpret those gradient boosting machine models, but they had to spend so much time doing it because it was such a difficult task and it was such a black box model that to gain the confidence that they needed to do, they were spending more time on the analysis than they were on actually building the model in the first place. So there was a lot of efficiency gain as well with the introduction of the layered GBM.
So Madeline, I have a tall task for you here. What I'm hoping you can do is compare and contrast the deployment of machine learning, and specifically this layered GBM, in the UK and the US. And really, what does employing this in the US regulatory environment look like?
So with a disclaimer that I'm not a regulator, not giving specific regulatory advice, we know, of course, in the US, the other challenge is that not only do we have more regulation than our friends in the UK, we also have 50 states plus DC to contend with in terms of being able to file models and complying with each state's individual regulation. So I think there are a couple of different ways that we talk here about implementing GBMs and just more broadly machine learning. I think one big way that also can be very helpful for insurers who might be contending with legacy rating engines or policy admin systems that might not be compatible with deploying a GBM is to use the GBMs in the background to enhance your decision-making process. So a few kind of key or quick examples are that, for example, you can use a GBM to identify the drivers of dislocation. So we actually, this past year in June, released a library component in our software that allows you to easily create dashboards that use a GBM pointed at the dislocation, so the changes between your proposed and your current rates, to say which variables are driving that. All of us know on the insurance side, the biggest question when you implement a new rating plan from a lot of your key stakeholders, regulators, senior management, agents, is, okay, well, what's causing this change? My rates went up 50%. Why did they go up 50%? And so being able to pinpoint and give relative weightings to these different variables, I think, becomes a very valuable thing for the business.
Yeah, I can imagine those data points would be key points to have when having conversations with key stakeholders.
Right, as opposed to sitting there and saying, okay, well, I, did a few test cases, or here, let me show you, like being able to, actually quantify the changes. Another thing that we think about, again, kind of within the context of understanding that a lot of folks want to still deploy a traditional GLM, which I know to Rachel's ears in the UK sounds quite antiquated and quaint, is that we're able to use a GBM and other machine learning techniques to automatically identify segments that maybe need further review. So for example, looking at and saying, okay, well, these are the biggest variables that would be of the most importance in a traditional GLM, as opposed to doing some of the traditional techniques like forwards or backwards regression, that type of thing. And so being able to automatically identify, okay, here are my top 20 variables I want to look at. Let me see what the gain for each of those is in the model. And then maybe I can even see and we have worked on this recently, being able to see that when I add 5 more additional variables, I'm only getting a little bit more lift. So it's probably not worth the extra cost, which I think is another thing that from the business standpoint is really important to talk about is, okay, yes, I might have a slightly better model, but is it worth the 20 or 30 extra hours that I'm going to spend on it? Or, the extra cost of, for example, purchasing external data, is that worth it? Or are we just not getting enough lift? We're already explaining the signal sufficiently with our existing variables.
So to put it in layman's terms, it sounds like rather than increasing the sophistication of your existing models, you can use this as a decision-making tool to highlight the areas that you need to deploy your resources to maximize the return on your existing investment in analytics.
Exactly. And I think, too, another thing would be to be able to identify interactions, because I think that can be another big challenge that can be a very time-consuming task, to weed through interactions, to figure out, okay, is this variable more important than the main effects, or is it really just coming into play in the interactions? And so I think that that's another key area that the layered GBM in particular is able to identify, okay, this much signal is explained by the main effect, but this variable is actually really mostly bringing in to the model from the interaction portion of it. So maybe something like payment frequency, you realize isn't as important to include as a main effect in the GLM, but really it's coming into play in the interaction.
Well, thanks for that. So as usual, our time here today has flown by, but I want to give you both an opportunity. If you could leave our listeners with one parting thought, what would it be? Rachel, let's start with you.
I think for me, the one thing I'd like to leave everyone with is almost just an encouragement that it's not just about, we're the insurance industry and we're a little bit more behind everyone else and we need to catch up and use machine learning and all of that kind of stuff. I think it's really important to actually look deep down at what problems we have that not many other people have and really try and innovate around actually what can we do to solve these problems. Because It could be the same as, oh, let's just use some open source machine learning to solve this problem. Or it could be, as we've done here, create an entirely new algorithm to solve that problem more directly. And even then, it's in the UK, we can just use this algorithm, to deploy it directly into production to produce rates. But Madeline and her team in the US, take it a completely different direction and saying, well, yes, sure, we can't deploy GBMs directly in most cases, but, here are these 10 other ways that we can use it to make everything a lot more efficient and a lot better. So I think that's the thought for me that I'd like to leave everyone with is insurance is an incredibly interesting, very challenging, but exciting space to be in. And just making sure that we are continuing to innovate and really think about what's unique about the environment that we're in and how we can impact data science and analytics itself.
I like that. So often we have solutions and we go looking for a problem, but really let's just look at our problems and deploy solutions as necessary.
Yeah, exactly.
What about you, Madeline?
Of course, would echo everything Rachael said, but I also think being able to expand the reach of analytics. We've had a lot of really exciting developments in the past few years, but oftentimes, especially business users might have seen that as, okay, well, that's for the data scientists to handle, not really relevant to my job, not relevant to the C-suite, but really seeing that these machine learning techniques can make the decision-making process easier, democratizing access to models and data all across the enterprise, and can be really relevant to anyone from a product manager to the CFO, not just the traditional actuaries and data scientists.
I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you both for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ravi.
Thank you, Ravi. It was a lot of fun.
Well, thanks, Rachael and Madeline, and hopefully you can join us again soon. Thank you to our listeners for joining us today on Rethinking Insurance, and we look forward to having you next time.
Thank you for joining us for this WTW podcast featuring the latest perspectives on the intersection of people, capital, and risk. For more information, visit the Insights section of WTWCO.com.